a couple of tricks when it comes to interviewing and when it comes especially with behavioral interviews in general. The first one that I want to talk about is particularly applied in phone interviews, and actually I learned it by mistake, more or less. This would be employing, rather generic answers, primarily generic answers to the question you're getting asked, with the main intention of starting a conversation. Because what happens in these phone interviews is not the candidates who give the perfect answers who are the most likely to advance, apparently, but is the, of course, the candidates that are the most qualified. But behaviorally speaking, you might have a better chance to get a better rapport with that interviewer if instead of trying, to give a perfect star answer, a templated answer that has a high probability of sounding boring, you would try to get on a more general note and then, hopefully start a conversation. Of course, this won't work for everyone. I'm just giving you options here. And, so to be clear, the number one method to spot if someone has prepared for a behavioral interview or not is on whether they give general answers to behavioral questions. So this would not fly for sure in an on-site interview, but for the sake of building some conversation, this could be something you might want to consider. The second trick here that you might want to apply is starting basically from the concept that companies know pretty well what they're looking for, especially larger companies, and especially high-performing companies. They know very well what the ideal candidate looks like, but they will not share that with you from the job description, because that would open the gate for people preparing for or over-preparing specifically for those three things that make the best candidates for this role, and then the quality of the candidates overall will decrease, right? So this is why they are not transparent about this. However, what if you ask them what makes the ideal candidate for this role? Especially if you're talking if you're interviewing with someone who was part of creating these behaviors that would characterize the ideal candidate. For example, with a hiring manager, ideally. So if you would start the conversation with asking them a question, if at all possible, and they would give you this information, in my opinion, you have much better chances to actually pass that interview. And by the way, this also applies for the on-site interview. So even if you don't ask it in the beginning of a conversation, you could ask it towards the end, when it's the more traditional, okay, do you have any questions for me? And eventually, you could use that information for subsequent meetings with them. So no matter when you find out this from any of the interviewers, it will be very valuable, to the extent, of course, they would want to share this with you. Now, another trick, and this one is for junior roles in particular, junior, I would say mid-level roles as well, is, when you feel like, if you feel like the conversation doesn't advance to your advantage, or you feel like, you'd feel comfortable doing this, tell them you really want the job. Okay, so just evaluate how would it be interpreted if you say this? Would it be something you'd feel comfortable doing? Some people do, and it's not me who invented this. I've heard this a number of times. So it does work in the right scenario, and again, for more junior to mid-level job applicants. So in case if at all makes sense to you, or even if it doesn't, but you feel like you have nothing to lose, you could try this option as well. It's a bit of theater, and theater might go well within these behavioral interviews. The next tip, number 4, would be in particular for very senior roles. And it applies to a technique of answering behavioral questions, a rather counterintuitive one of getting asked a positively framed question, as in, how do you show customer obsession, for example, and your answer should be to highlight your customer obsession with a failure. So basically the algorithm would be to try to talk about failures and shortcomings in your career to highlight your capability to do the job through the learnings, and of course by talking about proper negative stories that make sense. It's a rather unique approach. It's especially for people who are really comfortable with behavioral interviews, manager, director level roles, but it's something that I found out to be quite an interesting strategy that could actually be appreciated for senior to very senior types of roles, because if you're applying for a more junior, mid-senior level role, you don't have to necessarily talk about failures unless you're getting asked to talk about failures. But the context changes a little bit the higher you go in the ranks. Or who knows, maybe if you believe that's the one chance you could make an exceptional performance, you could also consider it for a mid-level role as well. So the idea is, again, to answer with a failure to pretty much any question they ask you, in order to highlight that you own the failure, and more importantly, how you grew from that failure. So this would be the technique. And number 5, last but not least, and again this is for very senior roles or mid-senior and above, this would be, while getting asked the question, instead of employing a normal star answer, to start with a more general note and then with a more general introduction, and then give 2 or 3 small star answers. For example, what's your management style? You could have an introductory statement of 1 or 2 sentences, and you could give 2 or 3 examples that would highlight your management style, in the sense that it would make sense for the interviewer. So this basically is another way to communicate in a behavioral interview, as opposed to just giving a rather templated and often boring star answer. So again, instead of giving 1 star, give 3 smaller star examples, right? And this could go with your weakness or with your strength, and with many other cases. So I'm just giving you this information so you make the conversation more engaging and more interesting. So hopefully you found this advice useful.